Let's make sense of this.
Let's make sense.
Sense makers.
Hey guys, nice to see you again.
Hey, Matt.
Hey, Matthew, what you got?
So I've got part one of the Alteryx Expert Exam. We're going to be focusing on in-database today.
Okay.
So for a little bit of background on me, I'm Matt Montgomery. I'm an analytics engineer working with Action, specializing in business intelligence and IT. I have every Alteryx certification, including the Expert Exam, which has around 50 people worldwide. And that's kind of the scope of this series, is the Expert Exam.
Yeah, great. Looking forward to it.
So we're going to break this down into three parts. The first one that we're going to talk about is going to be read watch. So this is going to be some documentation. This is going to be ways to kind of educate yourself and get prepared, especially if this is a topic you're not comfortable with. The next topic we're going to talk about is practice, and that's going to be some useful, tangible examples that we can kind of figure out how to apply these concepts. And the final one is going to be approach. Tips and tricks, recommendations, ways to kind of use your time efficiently when studying.
Okay.
Sounds great.
So read watch, that's going to be the scope of this video. And I think it's important before necessarily diving in is to kind of see what Alteryx gives you. Because at the end of the day, this is Alteryx's exam. You want to make sure that you're following their guidelines and their tips and tricks, because they're going to give you pointers that it's going to make it easier to study. So they give you a video to watch. They give you documentation to read. And so reading the documentation is helpful. Understanding their criteria is a good first step. You always want to have that stuff handy. This exam is open book for Alteryx content. So if you are stuck, you forget syntax, you forget what a tool does or how it's configured, you can use it. You can go to those websites. You can click on those links. You can have those tabs open, and it's generally recommended to have it open in a pinch when maybe there's some little nuance that you need to remember. And so the tools and scope are going to be around connecting, joining, formula, and then data streaming. So what I want to do now is I actually want to show you how to actually approach this type of problem using Alteryx. So this is the one question type on the exam that does not have any weekly challenges around it. Every other topic that you're going to see uses some level of weekly challenge or some sort of practice problem that you can use. The problem with this one is it's hard to do a weekly challenge that revolves you setting up a database. Like, it's easier to just give you a file and go. So it can be prohibitive, especially if this is your first time working in a database or you don't work with it very often. This is not the most challenging topic in terms of the ask. The challenge is really just knowing the syntax of the database you're in and then how to use it. So what I kind of want to show you here is a handful of tools. And these tools here, select, formula, data stream in, which I'll get to in a minute, join, and browse. Like, these are standard tools. Like, anybody that's passed the advanced exam or uses Alteryx is going to be familiar with all these, tools. They just have a different color because they're in database. The first one that you're going to have to educate yourself on and be cognizant of is your input. So in database has its own tools. They're up here in this tab. It's called in database. It's this dark purple, and you're going to do connect in database.
Matthew, I'm seeing here is that the connection name is MySQL Alteryx. Did you set up a MySQL for this?
I did, yes. So what happened in this case is I created my own database using MySQL, which is a free download edition. It took me about a half an hour to configure it on my personal machine.
So you're running both MySQL and Alteryx on your laptop?
Yes.
Great.
So in the services. I'm running it on the exam. Whatever database that is going to be running, most likely will be set up for you. But what you're going to need to do is you're going to be given some sort of instructions. And what those instructions are going to involve is if you come up to Alteryx and go to advanced options and you go to the manage in database connections, this is the first step of the problem. They are going to want you to get to this tab. They might explain how to get there, they might not. But what they're going to do is they're going to give you instructions on how they want this configured. So your database could be Microsoft SQL Server, could be MySQL, could be Oracle, it could be a generic ODBC. That's at the discretion of the exam, but it's going to be one of these. So for this example, I did a MySQL. And then you just work your way down. So the next one is a user, connection type, or a file. So a file is exactly what it sounds like. If they give you a configuration file, all you then need to do is just click on the ellipses, find the file, connect to it. The other option I have here is just a user, and then this is functionally what is going to be in that file, and it'll just give you steps. So if you're looking at connections and it's not set up yet, you'll create a new one, and then you'll build. So I've already built one. And at the end of the day, you just give it a name. So this MySQL Alteryx, which is what I set up, matches here with the connect in database. And then you're going to be given instructions about a driver and then a connection string for reading as well as writing. This can seem a little intimidating. Once again, the way they'll set up the exam and the way they'll set up this part is going to be very mechanical, and it's more about following instructions and steps than it is testing your ability to configure maybe a non-standard database. They want this to be intuitive and straightforward, so they'll either give you a file and you connect to the file, or they just say, name your connection this is your driver, here's your connection string, follow the steps. This can trip people up. This can get a little tricky and be a little nerve-wracking because it might be outside of your comfort zone. But just take your time, breathe, take your steps. And this, in general, could be one of the harder parts. Just get this done. You're good to go.
I would imagine that a lot of your proficiency with doing this depends upon how frequently you use the in-database tools, like day to day. I mean, increasingly, it's very difficult to be working with Alteryx if you don't, like most enterprise organizations will have a database that you can work with. And at the same time, myself, I've just always somehow managed for all of these years to just work with Alteryx without ever using the in-database tools. And so I don't have any exposure to them. And so I'd imagine that it's a fair bit of what they're focusing on here is just that you're familiar with and you know how to use these tools. Is that right?
Yeah, so what I'll end up getting into later on in subsequent videos is going to be around strategy for if you're experienced or not. But I'll just say at this moment, everybody that takes the exam should attempt this question, mainly because it's mostly about following instructions and just getting comfortable with a couple lines of code and syntax, and you should be able to solve the problem. It's not going to require a ton of tribal knowledge. It's not going to require a ton of, I would say, brain power with like troubleshooting, debugging, going in deep the way some other questions will. So this one should be more accessible. And so if you just follow these steps that I go through, you can just get some more confidence and give you some strategies on how to approach this. And it'll start with making sure that this follows exactly how they want you to populate.
Got it.
So once you have that connection string set up, then what you do is you come down to your connect in database. In your drop down, you will now find the connection you've just made. You can access it from the options menu as I showed earlier, or you can do it from the drop down here by doing manage connections or open a file connection. Either way accomplishes the same goal. But now that I've got my connection name set up, I'm just going to go to my query builder. And then this is going to show you a list of databases that you have access to. For this one, I just want my Alteryx one. And then I've just got my challenge that I need. So this is a weekly challenge 262. It's got 4 columns. It's got 2 dates. It's got 2 numbers. Very simple, but it actually will give me everything I need to solve this problem.
Okay.
So I just did a select star. You can certainly declare these. You can rename them. You can do whatever you want, but just to keep it simple, you can just do a select star, grab what you need, or select the columns manually. Either side. Something to note, if you do want to rename and you're comfortable doing it with Alteryx native tools versus writing SQL, you can. Just note that the select tool for in database allows you to do renames, but does not allow you to change the data type. If you want to change a data type, like if you have to join a string to a number or vice versa, you actually have to do that in a formula tool or in your original query, either way. So depending on your comfort level. So if you like writing in formula tools, that works too.
Somehow that intuitively kind of makes sense to me that when you're working in the database, that you can't really mess with the data type as you select the data out of the database. And this would just be, kind of something that's different when you're in a different paradigm here. We haven't brought the data over the wire local to my local machine. And so that select tool coming out of the database just is what it is. And I can't change the data type unless I use a different tool.
Correct. And so what it's going to require you to do is it's going to require you to write some sort of syntax. So in this case, once again, I'm working with MySQL. And that's going to be a key thing to remember. The database you're using has different syntax for writing very similar statements. To convert something from a number to a string in this case, I have to write a cast statement. I'm taking my ID column, and then I'm declaring it as a character 50, which is basically saying it's up to 50 characters in length is my ID.
Right, but if I was in a Postgres database, that syntax would just be subtly altered and just a little bit different.
Yep. And I'm going to have a whole section on kind of some of the nuances of MySQL versus maybe SQL Server, kind of show you what that looks like. But just understand that you can't just necessarily memorize, one line of code unless you're familiar with that particular database.
Okay. Does the exam always happen in one database or the other, or is it kind of all over the place?
It depends. So it's kind of at the mercy of the people that come up with the questions. But I would say in terms of a strategy, I wouldn't necessarily focus on one or another. I would just focus on maybe particular, just, practice with one, MySQL or SQL Server or what have you. Just practice in one, get comfortable with how it works there. And then if the exam decides to change what it's going to be in, have documentation for that database open, and then just understand how do I write, a cast statement in a different system.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I mean, as an Alteryx expert, you need to have versatility and be able to move seamlessly from one to the other.
Yep.
But you're not always going to have that stuff memorized either. So just being able to quickly get the syntax that you need for the database that you're in and keep moving.
Correct. So then what I want to do with this data, which is not uncommon, is that they'll ask you to do what is considered a hybrid workflow. So right now, these top tools are all using in database. They're in this dark purple. But there's a chance, and it came up, and it's not uncommon, that they will give you data that's not in the database. That's in a flat file. It's in Excel. It's in a text input. But they're going to expect you to blend that data together to your data. And they kind of tell you that with a tool called the data stream in, which is here. I'll get to data stream in a second, but I'll just kind of just make sure that I don't skip any steps. So let's say I'm given a very simple object, this file here. It's got 2 columns, 1 row in each, very vanilla. If I go to my select, I can certainly change my data types here, which is nice. So maybe if it's in the database and I don't want to change it there, that's fine. But if in the database and I have to join to another database, then I'm going to have to know how to write the syntax. So you do have a little bit of flexibility here, but don't necessarily assume that you can just kind of get out of jail free if, you can fix your data types here. But the mechanism to get data into your database is going to be with this data stream in tool. And the way it works is you will pick your connection name, very similar to your data stream in. The difference is what you're doing is you're basically writing a query into your database, and you can use any of these options. They will most likely tell you what option to use, but if they don't, I would just use the default create a temp table. And what that does is it just does exactly what it says right here. It just creates a unique temporary table name for each run. Basically that, like, when this job runs and then when this part of the query finishes, the table's dropped. So you're not creating objects, especially if you're running this every single time or you're running it multiple times. If you do a create, it's going to create a duplicate. If you do an overwrite, you'll be okay, but they might not want you to create a table. They just might want you to create a temp table. So just understand these are your options.
Yep.
And then once you're there, all you then need to do is then, follow the steps. And so what then you can do is, I need to join my data. And then let's say I need to do some sort of date time calculation. I can do a date time calculation. Like if they want you to subtract, the number of days between two dates. Not an uncommon ask. They put date diff as one of those formulas to know. So just practice it. And that's something I'll get into a little bit later.
And so that formula tool in database, is it going to have all of the same formulas that I could use, or it'll be constrained by the type of database I'm working in, or there's a subset of formulas that do and don't exist?
So the way it'll work is depending on what database you're in, I would focus on what they're asking you to do. So if they're just saying calculate the number of days between these two fields, I would just focus on like taking that question and then going to your source database and figuring out in documentation what they call that, because some call it differently in terms of like how this is declared, and then also just the sequencing of like how you construct your actual query. So this one just happens to be the MySQL version of doing a date difference calculation. That's just how it's set up. But if you're in another database, this might be called something different, and the way you have to order it's different. But if you just practice it, have that documentation handy, it'll be easier to go.
And I guess what I'm getting from your intro is that these particular questions are not about like saving the world and solving the most complex problem. It's really just about using these tools, right?
Yeah, it's using these tools. It's also just kind of like understanding how to solve a business problem, where most of the challenge is going to be knowing some sort of database language syntax, like knowing how to apply MySQL, knowing how to apply Oracle, knowing how to apply SQL Server to a problem. That's more of the challenge than it is to solve a challenge on its face that's very difficult. This is more just, we just want to make sure you're fluent enough in databases that you're somewhere, I would say, not an expert in working with database type problems, but, I would say an intermediate level. But this exam, once again, is 3 hours. You only have so much time to solve this. So you have to do this quickly. Given enough time, you can figure out what the code is and how to write it. It's just having it quick. So if you don't know this stuff by hand and you have to Google it, those are minutes that can just add up on a problem that on its face is not going to be too difficult to solve. But if you're not familiar with the syntax and you don't practice the code, it could take you longer, or you just avoid it, putting yourself in a spot where you might have to start solving harder problems that will require more time, more trying.
Yeah, you're going to have your blocking and tackling down with these set of tools so that you don't lose minutes off the clock.
Yep, and it's easier, and I would say this stuff is easier to study from nothing to get competent, to get to intermediate is going to be quicker than trying to go from maybe intermediate to expert on certain topics, which might take hours and hours and hours of practice, all these variations of all these things that you have to do to manipulate data efficiently, that could take a lot longer. Just going from basic to intermediate could be a couple hours if you know how to study properly.
Okay.
Yep. And then just final note, the browses, they'll default to 100 records. So just understand that going in, that it's not a standard tool browse that's going to give you all the data. You just have to pick the number of records that you want. Pick the number of records. There might be more in here. Just make sure that there might be more. This is the default. Don't assume that because it puts 100 and that's the default, that's all there is. There might be more. So just understand that if you need to see your data for how things.
This is the premise of these in-database tools, is we're really doing most of the heavy processing for larger volumes of data in the database. And so to browse that stuff, I'm really only kind of picking a little cream off the top, but I might need 1,000 records, not 100. And so that's up to me to discern what I need there.
And then my understanding is we're not going to see the records unless we have a browse tool, correct?
That is correct, Jonathan. So if you go tool to tool, normally within memory, you can see by clicking the before and after anchors, you can see a subset, maybe all of your data, but you cannot do the same thing in database. So if you do want to see your data or inspect it, you will need browses. So if you need to get a holistic view, you might need to expand your record count to a very large number. Or you might just need to check data quality along the way to make sure it's doing what you expect.
Oh, so if I'm working my way through some logic, I have to basically put a browse after every step if I want to see the in and the out and what's happening.
Correct. Yep. I cannot just click on a tool the way I can with standard tools and just see data as it comes. You have to declare it with a browse and declare the number of records. Something that they'll have as a checkbox is caching. I'll just note that there. So that way, if you just run this multiple times, it's just going to generate the same subset of data. Because sometimes generating these browse tools can take up a lot of time. So just be cognizant of that. So like if you're doing like browse first 100,000, just be mindful that if you have this unchecked or you clear it and you run it again, it could take a little bit of time to render, and that's where like these little seconds turn into minutes and can start working the clock again.
And is the exam going to focus on these particular tools?
Yes. So the exam's going to focus on these particular tools. I would say there is one other one that I would note, which is ultimately a write data into database. And then this is very simple. You don't have to worry about the complex configuration that comes with an output data. You just pick whatever output mode that they tell you to do. Generally, I'll define to an overwrite because you can do that on a first instance. And then they'll just ask you to give you a table name, follow their instructions. It's 2 steps. And these are going to be the tools in scope for this question.
Great.
Okay.
All right, so that's going to cover round 1, read, watch of in database. So you're going to have some good content to read about, some documentation, maybe some videos, including this one. And then if you have the ability and are able to get something on your machine to practice, that's great. It can take about 30 minutes to set up. The more practice you can give in Alteryx, the better. But in part 2 on practice, I don't want you necessarily to just be handcuffed if you are unable to get a database. We're going to go over some ways that you can practice and do some of this without even going into the tool at all and become better. So when the problem does come up, you can feel more confident and ready to go. And that'll be in part 2 on practice. See you guys then.
Super.
Looking forward to it. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Let's make sense of this.
Let's make sense.